The following is the initial part of the report from the Office of the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Report 1 of the 40th Statewide Investigating Grand Jury. Redacted. By order of Pennsylvania Supreme Court. July 27, 2018. Introduction.
We, the members of this grand jury, need you to hear this. We know some of you have heard some of it before. There have been other reports about child sex abuse within the Catholic Church, but never on this scale. For many of us, those earlier stories happened someplace else, someplace away. Now we know the truth, it happened everywhere. We were given the job of investigating child sex abuse in 6 dioceses, every diocese in the state except Philadelphia and Altoona-Johnstown, which were the subject of previous grand juries. These 6 dioceses account for 54 of Pennsylvania's 67 counties. We heard the testimony of dozens of witnesses concerning clergy sex abuse. We subpoenaed and reviewed 500,000 pages of internal diocesan documents. They contain credible allegations against over 300 predator priests. Over 1,000 child victims were identifiable from the Church's own records. We believe that the real number of children whose records were lost, or who were afraid ever to come forward, is in the thousands. Most of the victims were boys, but there were girls too. Some were teens, many were prepubescent. Some were manipulated with alcohol or pornography. Some were made to masturbate their assailants or were groped by them. Some were raped orally, some vaginally, some anally. But all of them were brushed aside, in every part of the state, by church leaders who preferred to protect the abusers and their institution above all. As a consequence of the cover-up, almost every instance of abuse we found is too old to be prosecuted. But that is not to say there are no more predators. This grand jury has issued presentments against a priest in the Greensburg Diocese and a priest in the Erie Diocese, who has been sexually assaulting children within the last decade. We learned of these abusers directly from 2 of their dioceses, which we hope is a sign that the Church is finally changing its ways, and there may be more indictments in the future. Investigation continues. But we are not satisfied by the few charges we can bring, which represent only a tiny percentage of all the child abusers we saw. We are sick over all the crimes that will go unpunished and uncompensated. This report is our only recourse. We are going to name their names and describe what they did, both the sex offenders and those who concealed them. We are going to shine a light on their conduct, because that is what the victims deserve. And we are going to make our recommendations for how the law should change so that maybe no one will have to conduct another inquiry like this one. We hereby exercise our historical and statutory right as grand jurors to inform the public of our findings. This introduction will briefly describe the sections of the report that follow. We know it is very long, but the only way to fix these problems is to appreciate their scope.
The dioceses. This section of the report addresses each diocese individually, through 2 or more case studies that provide examples of the abuse that occurred and the manner in which diocesan leaders managed it. While each church district had its idiosyncrasies, the pattern was pretty much the same. The main thing was not to help children, but to avoid scandal. That is not our word, but theirs. It appears over and over again in the documents we recovered. Abuse complaints were kept locked up in a secret archive. That is not our word, but theirs. The Church's Code of Canon Law specifically requires the diocese to maintain such an archive. Only the bishop can have the key. The strategies were so common that they were susceptible to behavioral analysis by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For our benefit, the FBI agreed to assign members of its National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime to review a significant portion of the evidence received by the grand jury. Special agents testified before us that they had identified a series of practices that regularly appeared, in various configurations, in the diocesan files they had analyzed. It's like a playbook for concealing the truth. First, make sure to use euphemisms rather than real words to describe the sexual assaults in diocese documents. Never say rape, say inappropriate contact or boundary issues. Second, don't conduct genuine investigations with properly trained personnel. Instead, assign fellow clergy members to ask inadequate questions and then make credibility determinations about the colleagues with whom they live and work. Third, For an appearance of integrity, send priests for evaluation at church-run psychiatric treatment centers. Allow these experts to diagnose whether the priest was a pedophile, based largely on the priest's self-reports, and regardless of whether the priest had actually engaged in sexual contact with a child. Fourth, when a priest does have to be removed, don't say why. Tell his parishioners that he is on sick leave, or suffering from nervous exhaustion. Or say nothing at all. Fifth, even if a priest is raping children, keep providing him housing and living expenses, although he may be using these resources to facilitate more sexual assaults. Sixth, if a predator's conduct becomes known to the community, don't remove him from the priesthood to ensure that no more children will be victimized. Instead, transfer him to a new location where no one will know he is a child abuser. Finally, and above all, don't tell the police. Child sexual abuse, even short of actual penetration, is and has for all relevant times been a crime. But don't treat it that way, handle it like a personnel matter, in-house.
To be sure, we did come across some cases in which members of law enforcement, despite what may have been the diocese's best efforts, learned of clergy sex abuse allegations. Some of these were many decades ago, and police or prosecutors at the time simply deferred to church officials. Other reports arose more recently, but involved old conduct, and so were quickly rejected on statute of limitations grounds without looking into larger patterns and potential continuing risks. We recognize that victims in these circumstances were understandably disappointed there was no place they could go to be heard. But we have heard them, and will tell their stories, using the Church's own records, which we reproduce in the body of the report where appropriate. In the Diocese of Allentown, for example, documents show that a priest was confronted about an abuse complaint. He admitted, "Please help me. I sexually molested a boy." The diocese concluded that the experience will not necessarily be a horrendous trauma for the victim, and that the family should just be given an opportunity to ventilate. The priest was left in unrestricted ministry for several more years, despite his own confession. Similarly, in the Diocese of Erie, despite a priest's admission to assaulting at least a dozen young boys, the bishop wrote to thank him for all that you have done for God's people. The Lord, who sees in private, will reward. Another priest confessed to anal and oral rape of at least 15 boys, as young as 7 years old. The bishop later met with the abuser to commend him as a person of candor and sincerity, and to compliment him for the progress he has made in controlling his addiction. When the abuser was finally removed from the priesthood years later, the bishop ordered the parish not to say why. Nothing else need be noted. In the Diocese of Greensburg, a priest impregnated a 17-year-old, forged the head pastor's signature on a marriage certificate, then divorced the girl months later. Despite having sex with a minor, despite fathering a child, despite being married and being divorced, the priest was permitted to stay in ministry, thanks to the diocese's efforts to find a benevolent bishop in another state willing to take him on. Another priest, grooming his middle school students for oral sex, taught them how Mary had to bite off the cord and lick Jesus clean after he was born. It took another 15 years, and numerous additional reports of abuse, before the diocese finally removed the priest from ministry. A priest in the Diocese of Harrisburg abused 5 sisters in a single family, despite prior reports that were never acted on. In addition to sex acts, the priest collected samples of the girl's urine, pubic hair, and menstrual blood. Eventually, his house was searched and his collection was found. Without that kind of incontrovertible evidence, apparently, the diocese remained unwilling to err on the side of children even in the face of multiple reports of abuse. As a high-ranking official said about one suspect priest, "At this point we are at impasse, allegations and no admission." Years later, the abuser did admit what he had done, but by then it was too late. Elsewhere we saw the same sort of disturbing disdain for victims. In the Diocese of Pittsburgh, church officials dismissed an incident of abuse on the ground that the 15-year-old had pursued the priest and literally seduced him into a relationship. After the priest was arrested, the church submitted an evaluation on his behalf to the court. The evaluation acknowledged that the priest had admitted to sadomasochistic activities with several boys, but the sadomasochism was only mild, and at least the priest was not psychotic. The Diocese of Scranton also chose to defend its clergy abusers over its children. A diocese priest was arrested and convicted after decades of abuse reports that had been ignored by the church. The bishop finally took action only as the sentencing date approached. He wrote a letter to the judge, with a copy to a state senator, urging the court to release the defendant to a Catholic sex treatment center. He emphasized the high cost of incarceration. In another case, a priest raped a girl, got her pregnant, and arranged an abortion. The bishop expressed his feelings in a letter: "This is a very difficult time in your life, and I realize how upset you are. I too share your grief. But the letter was not for the girl. It was addressed to the rapist.
The Church and child abuse, past and present. We know that the bulk of the discussion in this report concerns events that occurred before the early 2000s. That is simply because the bulk of the material we received from the dioceses concerned those events. The information in these documents was previously kept hidden from those whom it most affected. It is exposed now only because of the existence of this grand jury. That historical record is highly important for present and future purposes. The thousands of victims of clergy child sex abuse in Pennsylvania deserve an accounting, to use as best they can to try to move on with their lives. And the citizens of Pennsylvania deserve an accounting as well, to help determine how best to make appropriate improvements in the law. At the same time, we recognize that much has changed over the last 15 years. We agreed to hear from each of the 6 dioceses we investigated, so that they could inform us about recent developments in their jurisdictions. In response, 5 of the bishops submitted statements to us, and the 6th, the Bishop of Erie, appeared before us in person. His testimony impressed us as forthright and heartfelt. It appears that the Church is now advising law enforcement of abuse reports more promptly. Internal review processes have been established. Victims are no longer quite so invisible. But the full picture is not yet clear. We know that child abuse in the Church has not yet disappeared, because we are charging 2 priests, in 2 different dioceses, with crimes that fall within the statute of limitations. One of these priests ejaculated in the mouth of a 7-year-old. The other assaulted 2 different boys, on a monthly basis, for a period of years that ended only in 2010. And we know there might be many additional recent victims, who have not yet developed the resources to come forward either to police or to the Church. As we have learned from the experiences of the victims who we saw, it takes time. We hope this report will encourage others to speak. What we can say, though, is that despite some institutional reform, individual leaders of the Church have largely escaped public accountability. Priests were raping little boys and girls, and the men of God who were responsible for them not only did nothing, they hid it all. For decades, Monsignors, auxiliary bishops, archbishops, cardinals have mostly been protected. Many, including some named in this report, have been promoted. Until that changes, we think it is too early to close the book on the Catholic Church sex scandal.
Recommendations. Grand jurors are just regular people who are randomly selected for service. We don't get paid much, the hours are bad, and the work can be heartbreaking. What makes it worthwhile is knowing we can do some kind of justice. We spent 24 months dredging up the most depraved behavior, only to find that the laws protect most of its perpetrators, and leave its victims with nothing. We say laws that do that need to change. First, we ask the Pennsylvania legislature to stop shielding child sexual predators behind the criminal statute of limitations. Thanks to a recent amendment, the current law permits victims to come forward until age 50. That's better than it was before, but still not good enough. We should just get rid of it. We heard from plenty of victims who are now in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and even one who was 83 years old. We want future victims to know they will always have the force of the criminal law behind them, no matter how long they live. And we want future child predators to know they should always be looking over their shoulder, no matter how long they live. Second, we call for a civil window law, which would let older victims sue the diocese for the damage inflicted on their lives when they were kids. We saw these victims. They are marked for life. Many of them wind up addicted, or impaired, or dead before their time. The law in force right now gives child sex abuse victims 12 years to sue once they turn 18. But victims who are already in their 30s and older fell under a different law. They only got 2 years. For victims in this age range, the short 2-year period would have expired back in the 1990s, or even earlier. Long before revelations about the institutional nature of clergy sex abuse, we think that's unacceptable. These victims ran out of time to sue before they even knew they had a case. The Church was still successfully hiding its complicity. Our proposal would open a limited window offering them a chance, finally, to be heard in court. All we're asking is to give those 2 years back. Third, we want improvement to the law for mandated reporting of abuse. We saw from diocesan records that Church officials, going back decades, were insisting they had no duty to report to the government when they learned of child abuse in their parishes. New laws make it harder to take that position, but we want them tighter. The law penalizes a continuing failure to report, but only if the abuse of the child is active. We're not sure what that means and we don't want any wiggle room. Make it clear that the duty to report a child abuser continues as long as there's reason to believe he will do it again, whether or not he's active on any particular day, and whether or not he may pick a different kid next time. Fourth, we need a law concerning confidentiality agreements. They've become a hot topic in recent months in sexual harassment cases, but it turns out the church has been using them for a long time. The subpoenaed records contain quite a few confidentiality agreements going back decades, payouts sealed by silence. There are arguments on both sides about whether it's proper to use these agreements in securing lawsuit settlements. But there should be no room for debate on one point: no non-disclosure agreement can or should apply to criminal investigations. If the subject of a civil lawsuit happens also to concern criminal activity, then a confidentiality agreement gives neither party either the right or the obligation to decline cooperation with law enforcement. All future agreements should have to say that in big bold letters. And all this should be enacted into a law. We believe these proposals will assist in the exposure and prosecution of child sexual abuse, and so it is within the scope of our duty to make them. But to be honest, it's not enough. We don't just want this abuse punished by criminal and civil penalties. We want it not to happen at all. We think it's reasonable to expect one of the world's great religions, dedicated to the spiritual well-being of over 1 billion people, to find ways to organize itself so that the shepherds stop preying upon the flock. If it does nothing else, this report removes any remaining doubt that the failure to prevent abuse was a systemic failure and institutional failure. There are things that the government can do to help, but we hope there will also be self-reflection within the church, and a deep commitment to creating a safer environment for its children.
May the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all.